All right, you guys good? All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to yet another beautiful venue here at the festival. So we have a great panel of folks here to talk about ethics. Ethics in journalism, but also, as well, the ethics of covering other things, or the ethics that are happening in other professions that we often have to look at as well. So as I said, we have a wonderful panel of folks here. We're going to probably have a discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to leave 20 minutes for questions. So if you want to think of things that you want to ask, that would be great, and I'll give you a little bit of advance notice for that. So I'll ask something for each person here to start, and if you can, when answering, if you want to just give a quick introduction of yourself as well. I know it's in the program, but another sentence or two would be good. So Lucy, I want to start with you. This panel was your idea, and you write about business ethics a lot, and particularly with boards and governance. But you also do journalism as well. And I'm wondering for you, when you think about the ethics in the boardroom and then also in ethics in doing journalism, are there kind of universal things that float across that we should always be thinking of, regardless of profession?
Well, I'm Lucy Marcus, and also while we're doing the panel, if it works, then if you tweet at Lucy Marcus or any one of us, then we can also see if you have other questions or things that you want us to talk more about, which sometimes works really well for all of you at home and all of you who are here. Yeah, the reason I wanted to put this panel together with these particular people is because it's true. I write a column for Project Syndicate, a monthly column, and my focus is on ethics and business, corporate governance and boards, just as you said. And one of the things about it is I also sit on boards. Oh, the man tells me I need to be closer. I also sit on corporate boards. I sit on a board here in Italy, Atlantia. I hope you liked the airport when you flew into Rome. and also, you know, I'm involved with a number of things, and I have a background in private equity and venture funds, and well, I used to work for the U.S. Treasury Department, not this administration. And so I sort of come to this with what I like to call a eclectic, what my husband sometimes calls unfocused approach. And so as a result, when I put this together, I wanted us to think about ethics as it applies universally. So there are things that we need to think about within journalism, but I find that often when we're talking about things, and we spend a lot of time throughout the sessions talking about how do we fix what's broken and so on, but actually we don't have to invent things from scratch, because you know, journalism, like every other industry that I have ever dealt with, is fairly siloed. So we think that everything, you know, that happens within our industry is so completely different. Our business model is different. Nothing is the same. But actually, there are a lot of similarities. And so that's one thing, is that cross-sectorally, the things that challenge us are the things that challenge a lot of other sectors. And that also goes for leadership issues, structural issues, and ethical issues. And because of the global nature of the world, in that, you know, you put something online and anybody can read it from anywhere in the world. I mean, my column, I write it and it gets distributed around the world and translated into, I think, 13 or 14 languages now. But it, you know, and it gets carried by The Guardian, it gets carried by any number of places. But what's important about it is, and for Project Syndicate in general, I'd say, is about spreading big ideas. And part of that means that words are global, money is global. Money doesn't know where it is, it just knows it's money. So you no longer see, say, I read a lot about Japan and about Japanese corporate governance, and they can no longer say, well, we're Japan, we do things completely differently, because once you open yourself up to the international markets, you open yourself up to international accounting standards and international judgment by places like the Norwegian Pension Fund, who has certain criteria that it applies about the environment or governance processes, and they apply it to the companies in Japan as much as they would apply it to anything else in the US or in Italy, and so on. So we're beginning to see the fact that actually there's a bit of a a better understanding that there's a flattening or commonality of ethics. One of the things that I wrote about in my column this month was that I recently gave a talk to a roundtable of chief executives of public companies from around the world, and we're all sitting around, and I had I was talking about the moral maze, basically, and having a sense of true north. And a couple of days later, I gave almost exactly the same talk with exactly the same talking points to my 11-year-old son about what it's, going back to, sort of understanding what your true north is, first principles, and following your heart. One thing I noticed was when I gave it to one person, they fiddled a lot and said, I know, I know, I know. When I gave it to the room full of bankers and CEOs, they didn't do that, but you could read it in their eyes. They were saying, I know, I know, I know. But luckily, nobody said it out loud, and nobody called me mom. But also, it applies, those ethics apply to us within this industry. We make choices about, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, that we make choices about, a couple of families own a paper, and then they're not making as much money. And then they decide to sell it. And who do they sell it to? They sell it to a hedge fund, because that's money, but they don't think when they sell it that what's going to happen. Well, hedge funds, a lot of people have been bitter about hedge funds. There's a lot of reasons to be bitter about them, but it's a little like the scorpion. You knew what it was when it got on your back and you went out into the water. And so for people to be surprised about what they do, their job is to make money. Now, people like me, I write about and talk about and work with them on having a sort of ethical centered investment in making choices, but their ethics and yours, they're not going to care as much about local news as you might, because in the end what their job is to look at the numbers, make it work. And so, the money and the business model don't necessarily match up with where people are going. So I think what's really important, and the reason that we are all here in particular guises is for all of us, we look at the world through an ethical lens, whether how we're running newsrooms and also making choices to publish or not publish, or approach or not approach, or what we're going to do, or looking across and deciding, sort of how do we cover ethics, how do we write about ethics. For me, it's actually quite simple, because I write a lot about FIFA, I write about Japan, I write about the Trump administration, I write about, anything you can think of. There's, it's a little like the old fortune cookie, where you read the fortune cookie and then you add "in bed" to the end, so you will have great fortune, and then little kids go, "in bed," and then they think it's funny. But if you look at corporate governance or boards or ethics, and you say in sport, in media, in pharmaceuticals, in oil and gas, they're seemingly different, but they're actually very much the same. And the only thing I want to leave you with is, we were talking about how it looks when you go into a boardroom, and what's an ethical way of taking a decision. And one of the things I've written a lot about is Rawls's this idea of the invisible veil. And when you go in and you are taking a decision, you don't know who you are. So are you a board member? Or are you something else? And so the comparison that I give is, if you were somebody who had to take a decision about BP and the Gulf spill, and instead of actually going and thinking of yourself as, I'm on the board of BP, you stop and you think about it from the perspective of all the different people, and you don't know when you take the decision if you are the board member, the fisherman, or the fish. Would that change the way you look at things? And I'm pretty sure that the dead fish would look at it differently than the board director at the top. And that's part of our responsibility, not just as people leading companies or people trying to save or change sectors, but also as journalists, and the choices that we take about how we write and what we write about. And it keeps us brave, or it can keep us cautious. And it's just really important to think about that. But that's every industry, every kind of company, every sector. So
Thank you. So Indira, you're one of the few journalists in the world who has ethics in your job title. I think maybe you're the only one. I don't know. And so you've been really, I mean, this is a main focus for you. And I'm curious, in the time that you've had this position at Poynter, where you're strictly focused on ethics, what is the stuff that stands out to you? And when we think about ethics within journalism, Lucy talking about, you know, things cutting across industries, what's the stuff that might stand out for us that we have to think more about as well?
Thanks. Thank you guys so much for coming and to this beautiful venue where we're so fortunate to be speaking here in Perugia. As you asked us at the beginning to introduce ourselves a little, I'll say the perspective that I bring to this, because we all, of course, come from different perspectives. My perspective is as a lifelong practicing journalist, and I've worked on every platform, print, radio, television, wire service, and of course now everything is digital. And I think I come at all of this in a sort of, maybe you would call it back to basics way. I think that the ethical guidelines, the sort of guiding lights that should be guiding all of us, regardless of the platforms we work on, regardless of what we're reporting on, are, you know, baseline, are accuracy in everything we do. That's the primary #1 thing. Secondly, transparency about what we do and how we do it. And I'll talk more about this, but I think transparency is critical because at a time when we're all complaining about the lack of trust in journalism today, one of the critical things that brings it together is if we can explain, if we pull back the curtain, show how the sausage is made, and can explain how we commit journalism, how do we do it, that transparency I have found really builds trust in the process. And the more that people understand, the more that our audience understands how we have gotten something, the more likely they are to believe in the content and to trust the content. But I think the primary thing we have to ask our audience to do is to trust how we do our work. If they trust how we do our work, then it's much more likely that the output, the content, has credibility. And then the third part of that is accountability. So, you know, we have to be accountable for any mistakes we make in the same way that we demand accountability of public officials, we demand accountability of everyone we report on and hold their feet to the fire. We have to also be accountable about ourselves. And I'll just give you an example of what I'm talking about here. In the last year, so I've done all these different things in journalism, and I'm still a columnist for the Boston Globe. And a year ago, I had the great privilege of being asked to be the Newmark Ethics Chair at Poynter. And it's wonderful to have a perch from which to sort of observe my profession, which is still my profession, and think about how we can, as a group, collectively, be, again, building trust. Now, I also want to be a little bit careful about talking about building trust because you know, trust means different things to different people. And when we look at the longitudinal studies, there are questions about that. And an academic was here at this conference, Nikki Usher, who's at GW, and I were talking about this, about how old longitudinal stuff, when Gallup said in the 1970s that was the high point in America of trust in media, who were they surveying? Were they overrepresenting white males in that study? Yes, they were. So had they evenly represented people in the much more accurate way that we do polling today, would they have gotten a higher sample of African Americans and Hispanics and other minorities and women and maybe gotten a different answer, right? Because part of this is about people who are in the establishment trusting establishment things, and mainstream media is, let's face it, it's establishment. So first of all, let's put aside the question of whether trust has gone down since the 70s, because I think trust has always been about, I trust my media, I trust whatever I read, whether what I read is BuzzFeed or Breitbart or the New York Times, I trust my media and I don't trust other people's media. I think that's how people have always thought, and we've always had in the past a polarized print press before the sort of consolidation of print press, at least in the United States. So anyway, I think accountability is really important. Here's an example. In the last year, CNN had a scandal with a story that they did about Scaramucci's supposed business contacts with Russia. And he complained about it. He was at the time about to be named President Trump's White House communications director, a job in which he lasted for 10 and a half days, I think. But he was he was about to, no, I'm very accurate. He was about to go into that job, and he was very angry about the story, and he complained about it publicly and sort of punched up CNN. And CNN went back, and although they never said that the story was necessarily wrong in its core, what they did find was that the standards, CNN's standards, had not been followed. It had not gone through the correct process. And as a result, they took a mea culpa, they retracted the story, and the 3 journalists who were involved lost their jobs. Contrast that with Fox News, which spent 10 months on an investigation into the supposed murder of Seth Rich, a young Democratic National Committee aide who was murdered, and it's been a right-wing conspiracy theory in the United States that he was murdered because he was supposedly the link in WikiLeaks, et cetera, of the Hillary Clinton emails and DNC emails. They published this story, and immediately after it was published, the main source came out and said, hey, wait a second, no, they've overstated what I said, I didn't say that, and I said it because of this, and I was hitting on the reporter, and blah, blah, blah. There was all this weird stuff that came out, and they did quietly retract it, but they never ran a correction. They never explained what happened. They never opened up and did a sort of autopsy of how that situation took place. Sean Hannity continued to talk about the story for something like 2 weeks, even after it had been taken down, and it continues to live on in the right-wing media ecosystem. My point is not that CNN did a fantastic job. They could have been a lot more transparent about it, but there is a difference between the way those two dealt with it. So I just want to sort of give a shout out to the idea of remembering what our core principles as journalists are, which is seek truth, report it as fully as possible, act independently, and minimize harm. Those are the basic things that guide us in our work, right? And so just in the same way that we demand accountability of public figures, and I want to say that I think Politico in particular has done a fantastic job of holding members of Donald Trump's cabinet accountable through reporting, not through opinion, but through reporting, tracking down how much was spent on personal flights, how much first-class travel, how much was paid for sofas, things like this. And they've actually gotten results out of that several cabinet members have had to step down. So if we are going to demand accountability with our best reporting and get results, we also have to demand accountability of ourselves. So I don't want to belabor the point, but that's my main point. And then just another thing, and we can come back to this, I think that what's different about today than 15 years ago is technology is changing faster than we're even aware of it. And so there are all sorts of new realms for worrying about the ethics of news gathering, whether that's through using social media, whether it's through the use of AR and VR tools that we develop. There are so many other elements that we have to worry about that are different from old-timey news gathering, but I still think old-timey principles apply to the new things that we're doing. And one thing that I think was really great for me as a reporter, starting out as a Metro reporter, as a COPS reporter, and then as a foreign correspondent, is I learned on the job certain standards that I had to abide by. And I think one problem is a lot of young journalists now are starting out in new platforms where nobody is teaching them or telling them about basic journalistic principles. And if you're only aggregating and not learning how to report from the beginning, it's not your fault if nobody told you how journalism works. So it's on us to set examples and standards, not just through journalism schools. Not everybody goes to journalism schools, but in every workplace where we're bringing in new people into the profession, explaining how we make the sausage both to them and to the public with whom we share our reporting.
Thank you. So one of the things I want to talk about is how adhering to our ethic of accountability and corrections is often being weaponized now, how you often get punished when you're adhering to that. So I want to come back to that example in a second, and actually I should disclose that one of those reporters from CNN that was fired now works for us at BuzzFeed. And actually the report that they published, one of the central claims in it has now been proven true, exactly. Which is crazy. The report was right. Yeah. The process was. That's why
said that.
Yeah, it's wild. So we'll come back to that because I think that's a really unique thing of what's going on right now, the weaponization of actual ethical practice in journalism. But Alan, I want to sort of bring you in from the start. You were running The Guardian. You've now had time to look at things from a little bit of a distance. And I'm wondering for you, having this different perspective now, are there things that you're seeing going on now that you're not running a newsroom on a daily basis that stand out to you? And I'm also wondering if there are any decisions that you made while you were editor of The Guardian that you now think, oh, I might have done that differently.
Okay, let me think about that. It's just yes. It's a very private world. So I'm Alan Rusbridger. I edited The Guardian for 20 years. I'm now at Oxford, where I run a college, and I also chair the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And I've just spent the summer writing a book about news and the transition from well, the transition we all know about, but actually hasn't been written much about from the inside. That's my book. I mean, just a couple of things which I think grow on what we've heard about already as an outsider now. I mean, one is I think the press covers the press really badly. Just doesn't know how to do it, really. Sorry, Craig. But
I'm going to retire now. I mean,
and especially, I think the British press. So we want two narratives to be believed. One is that the media and the press is this incredibly important, influential force in life. But secondly, we don't want to write about it. And I think I got into so much trouble doing this when I was editing, because here was an industry that felt very beleaguered and very paranoid and very sad about itself in some way, and felt that our duty as journalists was really to circle the wagons and not wash our dirty linen in public and not to break ranks. And I just felt that was wrong. You can't have it both ways. If we are this powerful force in public life, which I think we are, and rightly so, then, as Indira said, we have to have the same degree of accountability as anybody else. But it took seven years for Nick Davis to do his reporting on phone hacking, and for a large part of that 7 years, which was a major ethical catastrophe in the most powerful media organization in the world, probably, and nobody wanted to touch that story. And if that had been an oil company or a car company or a bank, the entire board would have gone, and journalists would have been swarming over that story. And it took about 5 years for any other journalist, really, for most journalists to want to touch that. And it carries on happening. So there's now nobody. Everybody went into a spasm of denial about the Leveson inquiry. Phone hacking on other papers nobody wants to cover. The chief political commentator walked out of the Telegraph saying this is a deeply compromised company. Nobody wanted to cover that. Recently, somebody has come out and said there was consistent phone hacking, phone blagging, and invasions of privacy and criminality at another British paper. Nobody wanted to cover that because I think we don't know how to, and we feel so threatened as an industry. We feel it's bad for us generally to do it. So I just find that puzzling. And the second thing, as somebody who's not in it now, I always wince when I hear journalists use the word truth. I think, we tell truth to power. Well, we do our best. We can certainly be truthful, but can we be honest about what we do? And I think, again, it builds on what both of you have said so far, that journalism is the process of journalism is hurried, it's flawed, it's bound to be riddled with error because of the pressures on us and the attempts to stop us from getting at the truth. So we can certainly be truthful in all we do, and we can get at a version of the truth if we're really good. But we will make mistakes, and it's a very imperfect art. And we find it difficult to be honest about that. I find that the approach to correction which correction I think should be an intrinsic part of journalism. It is just part of it. It is very, very patchy and fraught, if at all. And there are no agreed standards about how correction is done. You know, theoretically, all British papers are signed up to a code which requires them to correct errors. And there are some very dodgy papers which I read every day which never correct anything. And I think that cannot be true. It cannot be right that this paper is making no mistakes at all. And that comes down to what we... It's a big question about what journalism is. And I completely agree that the more honest we were about the nature of what we did, of what we do, the more people would trust us, because people know. I mean, people know that this is not the truth they are reading, because of the nature of the way that media has changed in the last 10 years. So if we could have that starting point, then I think you would develop a different way of doing journalism. And there's an example which I think of, which is someone like Glenn Greenwald, who I know is a sort of divisive figure in the minds of some, but nevertheless Glenn had never been taught how to be a journalist because he was a lawyer. And so nobody had ever told him that how you do journalism is you write your story, and then you press send, and then you go down to the pub, because that's obvious, that's how journalism is done. And Glenn, in his innocence, working at his kitchen table with his 13 rescue dogs in Rio de Janeiro, would press send and then make himself a cup of tea and then sit down, because he thought, this is the interesting moment in the life of the story, because now I find out, have I got it right? And his readers would come back and he would talk to them for the next 3 or 4 hours. And they would say, well, actually, there's a mistake in the second paragraph, and the third paragraph could be better, and the fourth paragraph, you've forgotten to put the link in, and the fifth paragraph, you might want to add this. And by the end of the evening, the story would be better, because he wasn't saying, look, here's this tablet of stone, and by the way, if you want a correction, talk to my managing editor, and if you're lucky, you'll get one in 6 weeks' time. He was saying, look, this is just work in progress. And that whatever you think of Glenn, that seems to me a very honest approach to what journalism is. And as a journalist, we all ought to be at our computer terminals for a couple of hours after we publish, dealing with the feedback and looking on Twitter and seeing what people are making of it, and answering and being accountable and more transparent. And I just think, well, that's such an obvious thing, but if you ask journalists, would they ever do that? They look at you in horror and say, no, I don't want to talk to these people, they're morons. Have you seen the comments underneath my articles? That's a cesspit. I never read my comments nowadays because I just don't want to get involved with it. So you've got this fundamental lack of even agreement about what journalism is trying to do, which has, of course, got a very strong ethical element to it. And I think unless we can talk about that and arrive at a sort of common idea of it, then this business of trying to build trust in what we're doing is going to be very, very hard.
Yeah, so make it short. Okay.
I just want to make a very short comment on what Alan said, which is I love the idea of iterative journalism, where we are building on and learning from our audience in the most positive way. Obviously, not everything everyone is going to tell you is going to be right or useful or accurate. But, you know, David Fahrenthold has shown how to do this by crowdsourcing reporting through Twitter and getting other people, some who are regular people who aren't journalists, some who were a journalist in Palm Beach who went to a Trump Doral resort and found that painting within hours of David posting saying, I want to know where this painting is, where is it? And I think it was Enrique Acevedo, a TV reporter, then said within less than 24 hours, here's the painting, I found it for you, and tweeted the picture, right? So yes, you can build that way. Yes, what Glenn Greenwald is doing is great, taking the best stuff from people. One thing I object to is the New York Times has been blamed for doing this a lot, which is making changes to stories online and not acknowledging them, both changing the headline and taking out offending sentences that they were told, well, that's not right, or adding in material. I mean, it's fine to update stuff online, but be transparent about what you're doing, whether that means allowing your readers to see version history or attaching an editor's note that said, we have removed this sentence for the following reason, instead of just pretending that nothing ever happened.
But I completely agree about that. And the former reader's editor of The Guardian invented, I think, the term invisible mending for this. You invisibly mend it. And but it's a very good example of how there is no common standard. I wrote to the British press regulator the other day because the little village in which we live had a story that was written about in the Daily Mail, in which the headline referred to thugs going in and vandalizing the graves of Polish airmen. So you read from this that this was a story of sick British nationalists going and destroying gravestones. Fantastic story. It wasn't true. What had happened was that a tree had fallen down and smashed these things. So the Daily Mail invisibly mended this story to replace thugs with trees.
It was just a typo.
It's just a typo.
We both start with T.
But as you read this mess of a story, they still had the MP saying, earlier the MP thought that, and then underneath there's a stream of vile comments about these thugs, which are completely wrong because that's not what the story was. But it was a completely, the story ended up as a complete mess. A story that is published by the man who chairs the ethics committee of the British press, because the British press has never had that discussion about noting errors and correcting them as you go. Because
the most famous paper in the US is changing stuff all the time,
well, there you
and not
go.
being transparent about it, and that is a real problem.
So corrections have come up a couple times. Let's talk about something that it keeps being. You wanted to just add one more thing?
There were
Sure.
a couple of things that people had said. And by the way, I'm just picturing the story with the MP's quote. It's trees like this all across Britain, ruining.
Sick trees.
Trees like this are vandalizing. It's disgusting behavior. There were a couple of things that I thought were interesting in this, just for tying back into to some of the other themes. You talked about the things that are important for ethical journalism. Going back to basics: accuracy, transparency, accountability. That's exactly what I talk about when I'm talking to board directors about how to be decent board directors. That is one of those true north things. That's pretty much how you're supposed to do everything. Parenting, writing, leading, teaching. It all is supposed to look like that. So again, that's a perfect example of this true north that's universal. I mean, shouldn't we all just do that? Not to sound like a Pollyanna, but I guess I am a little bit of a Pollyanna. You talked about how the study of media, how we're not very good at writing about media. Yeah, a media story is the same story as oh, I'm so bad at this. I should have used one of those. As a pharmaceutical story or anything else. We were talking about a story yesterday, and you said, well, it's too small, and it's very specific to one sector and very specific to one country. And I said, how could we have sat here for an hour and you can tell me that about that story? That is a business story. It's international, and it's a perfect parable for generational businesses around the world and how things don't work out after several generations, and also we were also talking about the Denver Post and so on, and you cannot blame the people who bought it. You can blame the people who sold it, but you knew what you were getting. So I mean, those stories, those are business stories, or they're ethics stories, or they're leadership stories. And if we just, while we're writing them, substitute the word media for, with, pharma, and then go back and then put it back in, it wouldn't be as awkward as it was if it was a tree. it would fit better. And the other thing was this question of iterations and so on. One of the things that I say to boards more generally is we need to be less on send and more on receive. that we need to stop telling people how it should be done, because business is changing so quickly and the way we do things is changing so much, and listen instead about, you know, other ideas, new ideas. And it's the same with the industry as a whole. So just like we used to hit publish and go to the pub, we also can't say, and that's our business model, and go to the pub, or now we're digital, or now we're video, and go to the pub, because there is this constant backing and forthing, and we no longer, it's no longer one-way communication in anything. You know, the power of social media, I've written about this a lot, and activism, you know, means that when you had the spill, the Gulf oil spill, BP was used to talking BP to Kremlin and BP to White House. They didn't even know Facebook existed, and they certainly had never spoken to a fisherman. And all of a sudden, all the people at the bottom of this change, minus the dead fish, were being able to speak on their own behalf, and no one was stopping. And BP did not know what to do with that at all, because they were so used to being able to control the message. And you just can't control the message anymore like that. So I think that this dynamism, again, it's not just journalism, and these issues of trust. I was listening to Jay's talk yesterday as well, and he was talking about trust, and he was saying the same kind of things you're talking about, which is, you know, it's not about building trust, because, actually he was quoting Emily Bell, the wonderful Emily Bell. It's not about just building trust, because Breitbart has trust with their readers. And, you know, and Facebook has trust from their users until they don't. So we all just assume that they were doing the right thing, and we all assume that people are writing the right thing and quoting the right thing, and they're transparent with their corrections. But just like invisible mending is not transparent, nor is Uber paying off the guy who hacked them and then just not, you know, and paying him off so he won't tell anybody and pretending it just didn't happen. So again, these are all ethical equivalencies, and we're not special, and neither is anyone else. And we have to start as journalists as well, you know, saying, you know, when that hacking story came out, it was early on when I was writing, and I didn't know what I wasn't allowed to write or not write. And so I wrote the question, where's the board? And I was one of the first ones to do that. And when we started looking at FIFA, I was one of the first ones to say, where's the board? And why aren't we holding them to account? Because that doesn't, you know, they don't mean anything to me. But the concept, the truthfulness of it was important. So that was now you.
All right, so I would like to hear from each of you on this. If you have a suggestion of, do we need to do something different, or is it actually a case where it's better to just keep doing things the same way? So I talked about, or briefly mentioned, this idea of weaponizing correction. So the idea that if you're an ethical organization, if you make a mistake, you're gonna tell people that. You're gonna correct it, you're gonna apologize, you're gonna retract a story, perhaps. And what's happening now a lot, and people keep mentioning this to me as well, is that, well, CNN goes out and it fires 3 reporters, and so lots of people go screaming, see, CNN is fake news. They've got bad reporters, they get stories wrong. This is a perfect example that CNN can't be trusted. And so a device, a mechanism, an accountability structure that's there to show that we're accountable is actually then being weaponized and turned to say, well, see, they are admitting they get stuff wrong, why would you read them anymore? So the question on that I hear a lot of people asking is, well, so what are we supposed to do? Should we change the way we do corrections? Should we stop doing corrections? There are people asking this question now because it seems like corrections more than ever are actually getting weaponized rather than being seen as trust-building things.
Has anybody ever asked the readers what they would like? I know, that's crazy. I'm crazy. But
the question is, so what do we do? And for you, the first response is, well, let's test and see again, what readers...
It's that looking at it from somebody else's perspective. Nobody's ever said to me, what can we do so that you understand better what's happened here? That's why I used to love Margaret Sullivan when she was at the New York Times. I mean, I love her anyway. But when she was in the New York Times and she would write, you know, these quite long explanations about what happened. Or I love BBC does something as well where they have talkback or something, and then they go and they interview the editor of whatever story that someone is complaining about. I mean, granted, that's a long process, but the more transparent and the more you see, in some ways, how the sausage is made, the better in cases like that. So that's just one thought, but that's the first thing that came into my mind is, you know, and what makes me think of it is last year when we were here, people have been talking about how do we reach how do we give news to teenagers, and how do we make sure that that children understand fake news? And my question was, has anybody ever asked the kids? And so we had a panel last year with at the time, my 10-year-old and Jeff Jarvis and Matt Ingram, and a great conversation about, so how is it that kids get news and what they do with it and so on? And some of it was a real epiphany, even to me, the mother. So I think we so often try to find the solution, when actually, why don't we just ask? I know, naive, simple.
Indira, what do you think? Well,
I don't think there's any way we can stop making corrections. I mean, that
unless we
doesn't
stop
make any
making
sense.
errors, I suppose.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, what they say journalism is the first draft of history. There's a reason the word draft is in there. Of course we're going to make, I mean, you know, we have to hold ourselves to the highest standards of accuracy and try to be right all the time. But as Alan pointed out, you know, whose truth, and sometimes partial truth, and sometimes you find out you got it wrong. So we have to still make corrections. I love the idea of doing some sort of a study with readers or audience members to find out what's the best way to do corrections. I will say that television does not have the same ability to run corrections that a print or digital product does. With radio, the way it's typically done is like in a letters section, or at the same time, like let's say on All Things Considered, then the next day on All Things Considered, they'll say, we made a mistake about this story, blah, 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 and they'll post online. Television has not really figured out how to do corrections properly, and that is a problem. It should be, I think, in the same newscast the next day, but also posted online. Look, yes, you're right. Corrections have been weaponized. That doesn't mean we can stop doing them. I mean, unfortunately, we're in a situation where people's reactions to journalism have become not just partisan and politicized, but tribal. So it's gotten to the point where people are going to say, oh, see, that proves they're fake news. But again, to be part of the, you know, fact-based media, which I hope is what we all aim to be, part of the fact-based news establishment. I don't want to use the word establishment to imply that there's an establishment and yeah, you know what I'm saying. To be part of the fact-based news, then yes, correcting ourselves when we're wrong and being transparent about it is important. I don't want to pick on the New York Times, but they recently had a correction where there was a bizarre story in which the story referred to the Great Recession, but instead of saying the Great Recession, it said something like the era of shedding and cold stones. It was some bizarre, nonsensical line that they then, you know, readers of course saw that. I'm sure you saw that. And readers saw it and were like, what? And then the New York Times figured out, oh my gosh, that it's the editor on that story had a plugin, like a Google plugin that was like called Translate from Millennials to Snake People. It was just a parodic satire plugin that changed the term the Great Recession to something like the era of shedding and cold rocks. And so they put in their correction, this was a mistake, and pro tip, disable your Chrome extension of millennials to snake people. And I thought, that is so weird. I had to Google it to figure out what that extension was. I mean, but it was strange, but okay. I mean, it was like they were making a joke. In a way, it was like they were making light of it. What I thought was even more effective, though, was the editor himself went onto Twitter and took responsibility and said, hey, that's me. I'm really sorry. I had this humorous plug-in, and that was me. And I thought, okay, now that makes more sense to me. Now I understand how it happened. Now I understand what it was about. So again, communicating with your audience in a better way and understanding that not everybody is going to love you all the time. Whether you correct something or don't correct something, the person who thinks you're fake news, a term that I hate and I don't want to use, but people are going to think that anyway, so you just have to do the right thing and correct it for your audience who needs the right information.
So Alan, the corrections one is open to you, and The Guardian is well known for its corrections, especially in the British press. A second one I want to add on for you as well is, you mentioned phone hacking. Is there any story, any scenario under which you could imagine that phone hacking would be an acceptable way of getting information for a story?
Okay, on corrections first, there is, of course, a very effective global machine for corrections, which is called Twitter. And I think there are still some editors who haven't sort of quite understood this, that if they get anything wrong within seconds, that this is going to be exposed on Twitter and discussed, and your journalism is going to be discussed, but it's going to be over there. Or maybe some editors understand that, and that's fine because it's over there, and our readers aren't over there, and as long as they believe that it's all right here. So some of the papers that are worst at correction are the ones where over there you can see the full fallibility of the journalism, and it lives in two spaces. But anything more guaranteed to open up mistrust, quite rightfully open up mistrust about the whole process of what journalism is, than having it on full display over here, but a pretense here that it's not. I mean, I can't imagine anything that's going to destroy faith in all journalism quicker. So the sooner, I think the answer is more correction. Correct all the time, and as soon as possible and as public as possible. Then people will understand what journalism is, and then I think we'll have more faith in it. Phone hacking. What was your question?
Is there a scenario under which you, as an editor, would authorize someone in your newsroom to do phone hacking to get a story? Is there any scenario where that's ethical?
I think. I mean, there have been times when clearly I have probably broken the law.
Do tell, please.
Theoretically speaking.
Theoretically speaking. Well, I mean, I think somewhere in the bowels of Scotland Yard there are policemen who are still looking into Edward Snowden and whether there was a breach of the Official Secrets Act. And, that's not for me to say. And if there were, there is no defense to that. And but I think as an editor, you say, well, I'm going to assess what I think is the public interest in the story, whether I think this story is important for people to know, and suffer the consequences. And that is allowed for in the British in the code of conduct for journalists. Generally, it is frowned upon to go undercover, but there are some times when you think if the story is important enough, then I will go undercover. And I can imagine circumstances in which, if the story was very, 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 very significant, that somebody could justify phone hacking. I mean, I think it's in a way the security services published, who are also grappling with this, published a sort of similar sort of way of calculating it, so that the greater the public risk, the greater the harm, the greater the invasion of intrusion into privacy, you have to get over a very, very high bar of public interest. I mean, the difference is that they generally have to go to a judge in order to convince them before they can do it, whereas journalists can just decide to do it. And I think sometimes we forget what an awesome responsibility that is, and what Leveson laid bare was that on an industrial level in multiple newsrooms, people were doing this on an hourly basis with no public interest defense at all, and that was how threadbare the ethical underpinning of journalism had become in Britain. That people had not even any awareness that this might be an ethical problem.
I just want to note, we're going to take questions in just a minute, so please get them ready. Does someone want to follow up on that?
The only thing is, my only other thought is it's lazy. It's like plagiarism or other forms of doing bad journalism or bad writing. And I think that the other thing to avoid corrections is go slower. I mean, we're always now, because of the digital drive and the first to publish and so on, everybody's under so much stress to just push the stuff out as fast as possible. And also, I want to say, copy editors, I miss you. That is a cut to the newsroom that was a short-termism in action. When you go in and you want to say that you're cutting, salary, cutting all overheads and so on. Copy editors are not overheads. Copy editors have saved me more times than I want to say. And part of what happens is I lose trust when I read the newspapers, and some of them are phenomenally badly written and with terrible mistakes and so on. And then I think, why would I trust them if they can't even bother to cross their T's and dot their I's?
From every study that has been done shows that when you get an address wrong in the paper, or you spell someone's name wrong, basic things like that readers just dismiss the story as not credible simply, because the journalist was inaccurate, didn't write down the name of the street right, or got the person's name wrong. And that's why it sounds stupid, but my first Metro editor taught me, when you go out and meet this person on a crime story, remember to ask when they say their name is John Smith, is that John? Right. Is that Smith? It's so basic, but it's true. You can't imagine the number of times people said to me the equivalent of, no, it's Smythe.
That's absolutely right, and I really think that, again, looking at it as a business decision rather than the media business, and saying, we always cut the people who object the least, or, last one in, first one out. The short-termism of cutting people like copy editors, that's the ruination of business.
All right, so let's take some questions. There's a microphone that can go around. I see 2 hands up. They're going to bring a microphone to you, so please keep your hand up.
John's going to ask a tough one.
Yes, I will, actually. First of all, this is a confession as well as a question. I used to work for the Daily Mail, and after the Daily Mail, I then went to work for Uncle Rupert at the Wall Street Journal. And there was a huge change in so many ways for me that I had to adjust. But one of the things that stood out for me, Indira, about what you said was at the Wall Street Journal, if you got somebody's name wrong, you would have to correct that and put a correction at the bottom. You would have to fall on a hand grenade and send an email to your bosses saying, I got this person's name wrong. And I remember one example. This wasn't my fault. It was Barack Obama. We spelt Barack Obama's name wrong. And we put at the bottom of the Wall Street Journal article, in an earlier version of this article, we misspelled the President of the United States of America's name wrong, Barack Obama. So I was talking to a news editor there, and I said, why in the hell would you do something like that and look like a dork, yeah? And what he said to me, and it's resonated with me, was if we show that we do corrections on the small things, people will trust us much more on the big things. And yeah, so what you were saying there, Indira, just there before on Smith and Smith, just absolutely resonated with me. And I think in the UK, and certainly the Daily Mail wouldn't put their hands up and admit that they got this wrong, but I think the Guardian would do that as well. And I think there's a lot of Fleet Street newspapers, certainly online, where they get things wrong and that it hasn't been complained about. They will just correct it straight away. So I think the standards in American journalism, I think Fleet Street certainly has a lot to learn about. So my question would be, is can we have a standard, you said that, Alan, across the industry, that it may be a full soap, I think, but I would love to see a standard of corrections in the news media when we get things wrong. And I think that would improve trust so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I completely agree, but I don't know how you bring it about, because I mean, my sense of, again, externally, I'm not in it any longer, but my sense is of an industry that now feels even more beleaguered. And is, the way they're now all turning on Facebook, as though Facebook is, the cause of everything. And if we can only kick Facebook to death, then we can return to proper journalism, and life will be. And so I see a closing of ranks, and people believing the opposite, really, of what you've just said, with which I agree. So and after Leveson, the reaction. I mean, the acute discomfort of people having to give evidence in public in front of Leveson, and the sort of seething rage, really, at having to do that, and the repudiation of Leveson and all that he did, most of which was, 90% of which was completely right, in my view. So I think there's just that they're not in a mindset where where what you've just said resonates at all.
I was just going to add that, at least in the United States, journalism is an unlicensed profession, and there is, in the DNA of the Americans is such a free speech absolutism, and wish to remain free of regulation, even though there's talk now of regulating the platforms, that it's very hard for me to see where there would be some sort of requirement across industries, because of course we are an industry that has, there's no comparison. You cannot put in the same bucket the Washington Post and InfoWars. People call them both parts of the media, but they're not the same. They don't hew to the same standards at all. And so it's very, who would you even be licensing? Who would you be requiring to do what? The problem is that sort of, again, fact-based journalism organizations already hew to these standards. I spent 8 years at Bloomberg, which, people make fun of Bloomberg for having the Bloomberg way and this and that, but they are incredibly serious about corrections. And it was something where if you made the littlest mistake, even if nobody had noticed it, but it was like a moral opprobrium thing. You had to walk embarrassed to your editor and say, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed, but I did this. And then you would have to write your own correction, and it went in your personnel file. And I'm telling you that at the end of every year, when we got our reviews for salary and bonus and blah, 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 one of the grading systems we got was how many corrections and how did it compare to last year, and there was a chart for everything you did. The problem is, on one hand, that disincentivizes reporters from then admitting it when they make mistakes, because they feel like this is going to show up in my pay, or I could get in trouble or whatever. But, I was always of the opinion it's going to come back and bite you anyway. And by the way, why are you even in this profession if it's not to give people true and accurate information? So if you're worried about your paycheck and you're not worried about whether you've given the people accurate information, you're in the wrong business. You shouldn't be doing it. But again, I go back to the place where I think that it's hardest of all for us to hold television accountable, because there isn't a centralized place, and radio. Let me not let off. It's hard to do that in both cases. And then the more that you have opinion hosts, I want to say posing as journalists, because they're journalists in the broadest definition of the word. And I mean this this on both sides of the political spectrum, but if they're not identified as opinionators as opposed to journalists, they feel no compunction and no responsibility to correct anything, because, right, from their point of view, they didn't make a mistake. That's their opinion. But this goes back to where I'm such an evangelist about transparency and showing what everything is. I think in America, things would be so much better if Fox and MSNBC would label themselves as opinion. And when that Hollywood Squares looking thing that CNN does, where there are 9 of us on TV at the same time and everyone's shouting at each other, that should be marked as commentary. Because, in that role, when I do that, and full disclosure, I do that. I go on TV as an analyst, but then I'm being a commentator. I'm not being a reporter, as opposed to when I'm standing there with my mic in a stand-up and I've actually reported a story. But guess what? Smart people who are not journalists don't get that. And that doesn't make them stupid. It just means they're not journalists and they don't understand. And this is where this is why I was thrilled when Marty Barron and the Washington Post released this series last December, that 4 days after our ethics summit, which some of you went to. Both of these people here were integrally involved. Craig helped me do the Poynter Media Trust Survey that launched that ethics summit. But 4 days after our summit, they released a video series called How to Be a Reporter, in which they interviewed their reporters who had done the very controversial reporting on Roy Moore, the Alabama Senate candidate. And the reporters explained, this is how we talk to these people, this is how we got our information, this is how we vetted our facts. And again, that is how you build trust. Anonymous sourcing is something that people hate. And people are constantly saying to me, you journalists, I can't believe anything you say, because someone just calls you up and you just write down what they say without even knowing who they are. And I have to say, whoa, that's not what an anonymous source is. I know who it is, my editor knows who it is, we have vetted the information, but we can't tell you who they are because their job is in jeopardy, their life is in jeopardy, whatever. So we have to explain that in the story, in the text of the story, for people to be able to understand.
All right, let's get one more question. I know we're just about out of time. We have the microphone, somebody back there. Oh, okay. They're telling us we don't have time for more questions. Sorry, folks. All right, thank you to everyone.
There's a nice big courtyard out there, and we're happy to stand there and talk.
Thanks, Alan, Lucy, Indira. Thanks
Thank you.
all of you.